2 holes in a piece of bone, precisely spaced. Patient enough to wait 1.8 million years for someone to finally understand what they meant. They are the exact width of a leopard's canine teeth, and they are punched into the skull of one of your direct evolutionary relatives. For most of human evolutionary history, your ancestors had no fire, no walls, and almost nothing standing between them and something that wanted to eat them the moment the sun went down. To understand exactly how vulnerable that made them, you have to look at a single, small skull fragment pulled from a cave in South Africa called Swartkrans. In the 1970s, paleoanthropologist C.K. Brain examined a partial cranium, catalogued as SK54, and found 2 puncture wounds in the bone, spaced and shaped with unnerving precision to match the canine teeth of a fossil leopard jaw recovered from the exact same rock layer. It wasn't scavenging damage. Leopards don't typically scavenge, they kill. This was direct physical evidence, preserved for roughly 1.8 million years, of a member of the genus Homo, one of our own direct evolutionary relatives, being hunted, killed, and very likely eaten. And SK54 wasn't an isolated case. Researchers studying the Swartkrans site have documented similar carnivore tooth marks across multiple hominin fossils, alongside baboon remains showing the same predation signature, evidence of an entire ecosystem in which our ancestors weren't always the hunters. Often, they were simply prey. This upends a story most people carry around without realizing it. The image of early humans as scrappy but competent survivors, clever enough to handle whatever the wilderness threw at them. The fossil record tells a more uncomfortable version. At an estimated 28 to 52 kilograms, early hominins living between roughly 3.5 and 2 million years ago fell squarely inside the preferred prey weight range of the leopard sharing their territory. You weren't too big to hunt, you were exactly the right size, and the danger wasn't evenly distributed across the day. In 2018, a research team led by primatologist Lynn Isbell fitted GPS collars on wild baboons and the leopards, sharing their habitat to measure exactly when predation risks peaked. The data showed something specific. Baboons, despite being formidable and aggressive during daylight, became dramatically more vulnerable to leopard attacks after dark. Isbell's team argued the same pattern almost certainly applied to early hominins, and for a very particular biomechanical reason. Bipedalism, the trait that freed our ancestors' hands and let them carry tools, food, and eventually weapons, came with an unavoidable trade-off. Walking upright on the ground during daylight was a fine defensive posture. Climbing quickly and confidently into trees after dark, the way a chimpanzee or gorilla still does every single night without hesitation, became progressively harder as hominin bodies adapted more fully for walking than for climbing. The species was, quite literally, evolving itself out of its own emergency exit. So what did they do instead? In a world with no walls and, for enormous stretches of that timeline, no controlled fire at all, the archaeological and behavioral evidence points to 2 overlapping strategies, and neither of them required technology so much as coordination. The first was physical, building barriers out of whatever the landscape already provided. Isbell's research specifically notes that some hominin populations appear to have used stone tools to modify thorny acacia branches into what researchers call bomas, essentially improvised thorn enclosures that could ring a sleeping group and make a leopard's approach loud, slow, and painful enough to lose the element of surprise that ambush predators depend on entirely. It's a solution still used by pastoral communities in parts of East Africa today, built from the same plant, for the same reason, arguably unchanged in millions of years. The second strategy had nothing to do with objects at all. It was about bodies, arranged deliberately in space. Sleeping in a tight cluster rather than scattered individually meant more eyes, more ears, and more noses positioned to detect the earliest signal of an approaching predator. The same logic that still governs how herding prey animals bed down on open plains today. And within that cluster, biology may have been doing quiet work nobody had to consciously organize. Humans, unlike almost any other primate, show enormous natural variation in when we feel most alert versus most drowsy across a 24-hour period, what modern sleep researchers call chronotype. In a small group with a wide spread of chronotypes, some members naturally more alert in the deep hours after midnight, others sharpest just before dawn. The group as a whole would have experienced far fewer stretches where every single person was simultaneously in deep, unresponsive sleep at the same time. No one had to be formally assigned to keep watch. The biological diversity of the group did that work automatically, simply by existing. None of this made nighttime safe. It made it survivable, which in an environment stalked by leopards, hyenas, and other Pleistocene predators specifically adapted to hunt in darkness, was as much as could realistically be hoped for. Even with a thorn enclosure and a cluster of variably alert bodies, predation clearly still happened often enough to leave a fossil record we can still read today, a species-wide vulnerability written directly into bone. What eventually changed the equation wasn't a single invention arriving overnight. Evidence for habitual, maintained fire use doesn't appear reliably in the archaeological record until roughly 400,000 years ago. Hundreds of thousands of years after leopards were already leaving tooth marks on hominin skulls, and even longer after bipedalism had already begun trading away easy access to the trees. For an almost unimaginably long stretch of human evolutionary time, your ancestors' entire nighttime survival strategy consisted of thorns, numbers, and the accident of biological variation in when different members of a group happened to feel sleepy. Nothing more. Which makes it worth sitting with exactly how different your body's relationship with the night actually is compared to that history, even though the wiring underneath hasn't changed much at all. If you hear a strange sound outside your window at 2 a.m., the worst that happens is you don't sleep well, and yet you still feel a specific, disproportionate spike of unease at an unexplained sound in the dark. Even sitting behind a locked door in a climate-controlled apartment with no leopards for thousands of miles in any direction, that reaction isn't a personality trait or an overactive imagination. It's an alarm system built by roughly 2 million years of exactly the kind of nights that left teeth marks in bone, running on a body that no longer needs it nearly as often as it thinks it does. You are the descendant, specifically and directly, of the individuals in that thorn ring circle who happened to be awake at the right moment, who heard the wrong kind of quiet, who got the group moving before the leopard closed the last few meters of distance. Everyone else's line ended in exactly the kind of fossil that turned up at Swartkrans. 2 small punctures in a piece of bone, precisely spaced, patient enough to wait 1.8 million years for someone to finally understand what they meant.